What are the secret talks between Russia and the US about? What are these two countries discussing during this Ukrainian conflict? When is the next meeting of the Bilateral Advisory Committee of Representatives of Russia and the US scheduled for? Recently, there are more and more reports that Russia and the US are discussing negotiations with an ulterior motive. But what are Moscow and Washington really discussing? And are there any chances of reaching an agreement on Ukraine? The movements of international diplomacy are strange. Columnists report Biden is known to be officially leading a global campaign to isolate Russia, while powerful heads and officials of his administration are secretly talking to Moscow. This is reported not only by the American media but also by official representatives of the White House. In turn, Moscow has never refused to negotiate with the United States. Yes, Putin has often pointed out that the US is not easy in negotiations. It refuses agreements. Elena Suponina, political scientist and expert at RIAC, explains to Vizglad newspaper. So, of course, there is no mutual trust, but at the same time, there is no way to refuse contacts because too much is at stake. According to Suponina, on February 21st, at a memorial meeting of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev said that it was necessary to conduct negotiations with the West, and now, above all, how they should talk to the United States, because everyone else will do what Washington says. Initially, Moscow refused to comment on the subject of the talks, stressing that the lines are thin, the relations between the two countries are special, and so on, said Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's spokesman. However, on November 11, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov said that in late November, early December, a meeting of the Bilateral Advisory Committee of Representatives of Russia and the United States on the Strategic Offense Weapons Treaty START, which regulates the number of nuclear warheads and aircraft carriers from the parties, will be held in Cairo. The meeting will last about a week and will discuss a whole range of topics, among them the resumption of inspections, an attempt by the United States to withdraw from the treaty a number of aircraft carriers, which Washington says are used for non-nuclear operations. And because of this, there's a situation where the Americans de facto have at their disposal a significant number of strategic aircraft carriers, namely heavy bombers and submarine ballistic missile launchers, which at least do not fit the requirements of the treaty, Ryabkov said. Indeed, the issue of START is important to both states. Here, the parties have corresponding claims to each other, but regardless of the state of Russian American relation and complete mistrust, it's important to discuss implementation of the START 3 treaty while it is in force. In addition, it's also important to engage in dialogue on the outline of strategic stability issues after the end of this treaty. It's clear that we will not be able to work out a new treaty, but it nevertheless is necessary to talk about the prospects of strategic stability, emphasizes political scientist Dmitry Suslov. And not only to talk about the prospects, but to work out some new format for a dialogue on nuclear stability that will take into account the new realities in bilateral relations, Suslov said. Meanwhile, Russia-American negotiations do not end with START. The parties are not only debating about missiles, but also about people. In particular, the contacts between the US and Russia have not been interrupted throughout the conflict. According to my information, first of all, it was about contacts on so-called humanitarian issues, in particular regarding the exchange of prisoners, an example of which is the return of pilot Yaroshenko to Russia in April. Similar questions are being discussed now. We're talking about the exchange of Victor Butt and some other prisoners who are imprisoned not only in the US but also in the European Union. On the American side, they're talking about athlete Brittany Greener as well as Paul Whelan, who are accused of espionage, Supanina says. And according to Supanina, in these negotiations, the role of mediators can be played by both former US officials, for example, former US Secretary of Energy Bill Richardson, and individual countries. For example, Turkey, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and some others. For Biden, the fate of Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan was one particular of importance. It had the midterm elections for Congress. The American leader, the president, wanted to bring the Americans home and thus score political points, but probably the formula we exchanged 2 Americans for 1 Russian did not suit Moscow. Russia could demand a 2-for-2 swap. That is, join Vadim Krashikov, who is in Germany on charges of murdering Chechen terrorist Zelim Khan Kangoshvili. Experts believe that a swap deal could become a reasonable pretext and springboard for negotiations on other important issues, in particular to resolve the US-Russian conflict over Ukraine. In fact, negotiations related to the situation in Ukraine are already underway. Specifically, to manage escalation and reduce the risk of its occurrence, that is, to put it simply, preventing a direct military conflict between Russia and the United States with a nuclear element, Suslov said. The parties discussed, respectively, the limits of the red lines, define possible responses to each other's steps. Discussion of this issue is absolutely necessary without taking into account the complete mistrust between Russia and the United States, simply because the risk of escalation is high. Otherwise, there would be no such consultations. Neither Russia nor the United States is interested in a third world war and the use of nuclear weapons. According to a number of media reports, the Americans are also negotiating directly with Russia over Ukraine. The parties are trying to find ways to compromise, situations where both Russia and the United States can be declared winners. However, to date, the parties have yet to come up with anything. There's a lot of indirect evidence for this, and one of them is the refusal of the parties to hold formal bilateral negotiations at the G20 summit. The Putin-Maidan summit did not take place and will not take place on the sidelines of the G20 because we do not even have preliminary agreements on the settlement of Ukrainian conflict. Such dialogue and even such contact could make sense if the conflict had at least ceased and if the parties had some prior agreement on the contours of a peace settlement. Until that happens, then there will be no corresponding meeting, summarizes Suslov. This is from a Greek article I've translated for you, Pentapostagma. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.